Right. Well, thank you very much for taking your Saturday out to take an interest in antimicrobial resistance. I'm Bryan Deane, and it's an honour to be invited to speak at this conference and to help students who will be handling these drugs in the future. I'm Bryan Deane. I work for the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, which represents the innovative research-based pharmaceutical companies, large, medium and small companies who basically research and develop the majority of the current medicines pipeline and supply more than 80% of branded medicines used by the NHS. We're recognised by government as the industry body negotiating on behalf of the branded pharmaceutical industry for various consultations. So at the moment, I don't expect you to read all this, but there are about 7,000 possible new medicines and vaccines in development in a wide range of therapy areas. And this is a global view of the industry around the world. And the process for developing medicines really has been selecting the target that we might want to attack. This is generally for medicines, not just antibiotics. Looking at the discovery of lead compounds to do the job, medicinal chemistry to develop those compounds, in vitro studies to look at the potential efficacy, in vivo studies to look at toxicology, and clinical trials to start to bring this closer to the patients. We reckon traditionally that the industry probably used to screen about 5,000 to 10,000 small molecules in drug discovery to weed through that, funneling it through for each approved drug. So there's an awful lot of work that goes on through this pipeline to refine and find the molecules that are going to be effective but also safe. You've heard the average global cost of development around $1 billion per approved medicine, but that's an average figure. There's a pretty decent spend in the UK. It's about 15% of sales, and that's around the world average, but it's much higher in the life sciences and pharmaceutical sector than it is in any other sector, that proportion of sales that's invested. And in the UK, we employ about 61,000 people in the industry. And there are a lot of interesting jobs in all phases of this for scientists. So from the preclinical discovery phase right through phase 1 and 2 trials into the phase 3 clinical trials, where we're really pinning down the levels of efficacy and tolerability in real patients. Then the regulatory approval piece to the launch, the period of sales growth, which requires the manufacturing to be scaled up to commercial levels and eventually to patent expiry. And this was alluded to a little bit earlier, that there's an investment phase, obviously, before you get to the registration approval for all of this development work. And then you have a period up towards patent expiry where you have the ability to be reasonably profitable to allow reinvestment in the next phase of drug discovery and development. So it's a long and complicated process, and there's a reasonably high risk. So turning immediately to antibiotics, and you may know this already, but there are 5 major, most widely used classes: the penicillins, the aminoglycosides, the macrolides, quinolones, and cephalosporins. And as you heard, about 75% of the volume of prescriptions is in primary care, and the majority of those will be for one or other of these, probably not aminoglycosides, they're really hospital-based. But the other point about this slide is that all of these classes, as was alluded to earlier, were developed, the first in class was developed by around 1964. So penicillins 42, and so on and so forth. And I've just dropped in there tetracyclines and chloramphenicol at the bottom, because again, they're fairly reasonably used in primary care, and again, they were around before 1960. So those are the sort of classes of antibiotics that we're talking most particularly about. But I just want to make the point that since the advent of penicillin, the industry around the world, particularly in Europe and North America, has been beavering away at various other therapy areas. And these drugs are a selected list of first or second in class drugs for hypertension, asthma, depression, HIV, migraine, and breast cancer, etc. And the point to be made here is all of these are very, very good drugs. All of these reached registration. All of them have passed patent expiry. And most of these, certainly all of these classes, are represented on the WHO essential drugs list. We get efficacy in most patients with one or other of these drugs, and we've really stopped commercial development in these areas because the easy stuff's been done. So we're now spending a lot of time as an industry on oncology and immunology and areas like that where the challenges are great and the commercial returns are seen to be okay. And if it wasn't for resistance, antibiotics would be in this same boat because we've developed a lot of good antibiotics. And as you heard, the return on investment isn't as high as it used to be. So let's just frame the issue here about antimicrobial resistance. Life expectancy over the last 100 years or so has increased due to our ability first to prevent and then to treat infections. So the work of Lister and Pasteur and Robert Koch led to the first part of this graph, the reduction in mortality due to being able to avoid infections, particularly in surgery and in childbirth. But then we managed to treat infections when you did get infections, and that helped to continue to bring the deaths due to infectious diseases down to a very low level. And it also has enabled us to carry out other procedures, as I said, surgery, transplants, complicated surgery, cancer therapy where you have immunocompromised patients and that sort of thing. So we depend on antibiotics being effective in cases of all of those areas where infection is a risk. We do recognize that I think that infectious disease is different from some of those other therapy areas, because when we consider prescribing for a diabetic or for a heart disease patient or for somebody with a respiratory problem, we only need to consider that patient and treating that patient. When we're considering prescribing an antibiotic, we need to consider trying to treat that patient and eradicate the infection in that patient. But we also need to think, as we've heard this morning, about minimizing the effect on the patient's natural microbiome and to minimize the selection of resistant organisms, whether they be pathogenic or not at that point. And then thinking about the potential for resistant pathogens to spread, also considering the potential impact on the overall population. So with infectious diseases, it's almost a think twice, and we really must concentrate on this idea of prescribing appropriately. In primary care, and I'll draw this distinction, it's been alluded to already. In primary care, we generally have otherwise healthy patients who have reasonably good immune systems, and these common pathogens are usually like Streptococcus pneumonia, Haemophilus influenzae, and they're mostly still responding to one or other of those major classes of antibiotics that I mentioned earlier. The real issue at the moment is in secondary care, where you have more seriously ill patients. The pathogens tend to be opportunistic pathogens, maybe gram-negatives rather than gram-positives. And in many cases, pathogens that are not pathogenic in normal healthy people. In fact, E. coli is obviously part of the normal microbiome. So we really want to concentrate on this concept of appropriate prescribing. which we define nowadays as the right patient receiving the right medicine at the right dosage, in the right formulation, at the right time for the right duration, the right indication. So actually getting everything right. We're not really trying to reduce usage across the board. We're really trying to make sure that we use these drugs when they're needed, but only when they're needed, and use them correctly. And just a couple more points about the separation with primary care. Obviously, in both cases, we should be using only if you're pretty sure the infection is bacterial, not for colds and flu, obviously. In primary care, and again, it's been mentioned already, we want to concentrate on prescribing appropriately, minimizing the wrong usage, and that would help to minimize further resistance to the currently used antibiotics. And as we said, the most of those in primary care are from those major classes that we've had around for several years already. In secondary care, it's really where the problem exists, thankfully, for the time being. These opportunistic pathogens that develop resistance, E. coli, Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, and there we do need new antibiotics to combat these resistant pathogens. And these new antibiotics, if we can reinvigorate the development program and the pipelines and find antibiotics that will work against these resistant pathogens, we then definitely need to have clear, appropriate use protocols for those so that we reserve them for the right patients and preserve their utility, minimizing resistance against the new drugs for as long as possible. Quick note on the gram-positives or gram-negatives. There are slight differences which, in the structure which lead to slight differences in the approaches. And obviously this highlights that we're looking really at inpatients as where the problem is really manifesting at the moment. This is just a more complete view of the classes of antibiotics, and again to reiterate that really there hasn't been anything since about 1990 in terms of a whole new class, but I mentioned the 5 major classes. There are several other slightly smaller scale classes. Difficult in some of these areas to manipulate the chemistry to produce multiple versions. So, for example, with the, where are they? The glycopeptides, vancomycin, teicoplanin have always been particularly good against gram-positive Staph aureus, and they have tended to be reserved for the MRSAs and have helped us to, in the UK particularly, to control that problem a bit. So those are the full range of classes that we have available. I'm guessing that you've probably come across this type of information before, but when you look at a bacterium, they're actually not particularly complicated organisms, obviously, and there are a number of ways that we attack them in terms of mechanisms of antibiotic action. So beta-lactams particularly will attack the cell wall synthesis. We can attack nucleic acid synthesis, which prevents the organisms multiplying. Some bacteria need this folate synthesis pathway, which are specifically attacked by some antibiotics. There's protein synthesis, which is critical in any organism. That can be knocked out to an extent by antibiotics attacking the ribosomes where the protein synthesis occurs. And we can also attack and disrupt the cell membrane, which the bacteria can't live without. So those are a number of mechanisms, but if you think about it, and we've been working on this since about 1940, can you really think there are any completely new mechanisms that we might attack these organisms through? So it's very interesting to hear completely different approaches, like this morning, looking at attacking these with other microorganisms and either bacteria or even bacteriophage viruses. But obviously the risk there of introducing something else that's potentially pathogenic has got to be looked at very closely before we start using those in people. So obviously a variety of mechanisms of action in terms of the various antibiotic classes that we have. but then a variety of mechanisms by which these crafty little bacteria have managed to develop resistance. So inactivating enzymes that break down the antibiotics produced by the bacteria in response, selecting those bacteria in the population that can produce that enzyme, either externally or internally. Efflux pumps, which pump the antibacterial out of the cell as quickly as it can get in, blocking the mechanisms of uptake, saying I don't want that antibiotic inside the cell, so we can actually build some wall, prevent the transport systems which normally would let antibiotics into the cell. They can actually adapt and change the target enzymes or the target RNA inside the cell so that the antibiotic that used to work against those doesn't work against those anymore. So again, mechanisms for the antibacterials to work, but then mechanisms by which the bacteria have developed means of becoming resistant. So for many years, as we said earlier, it's a constant cycle. We develop an antibiotic, it gets used for a bit, bacteria get resistant, and then we go around the circle again, and that circle stopped a while back, and that's why we have serious problems at the moment with a small number of opportunistic pathogens, particularly in hospital. However, that problem is potentially going to get hugely bigger over the next few years. And there are 3 quotes here which you can read from our own Chief Medical Officer, Dame Sally Davies, who's been alluded to already, who's been very active and really a global leader in this area. Dr. Margaret Chan, who was Director General of the World Health Organization, and Jim O'Neill, who's the author of the AMR review, who's been alluded to earlier as well. So they've all been quoted as saying this could become a huge problem, we really should do something about it. Jim O'Neill's report framed this in terms of the potential that globally we might be looking at 10 million deaths due to resistant bacteria by 2050, and that's why you hear the words Armageddon and a major public health threat and that sort of shock, horror, comment and headlines. But certainly if we were to do nothing, there's no doubt that things could go in that direction. This generates also the potential for $20 billion in excess direct healthcare costs, because obviously these resistant bacteria are causing multiple treatments and multiple stays in hospital if we can't treat these patients. So there's a huge benefit to society to being able to prevent that. And the O'Neill report particularly estimated that we would lose about £100 trillion of GDP globally that would just be not produced because we're losing these people, because they're not just the mortality but the morbidity associated with them being in hospital and being treated with multiple things that don't work properly, and additional costs of lost productivity of maybe $35 billion a year. So there ought to be the potential for valuing a new antibiotic that works in terms of preventing this disaster scenario occurring. So the World Health Organization has published these priority resistant pathogens. The top 3 are the most critical, which includes your Klebsiella, your Acinetobacter and Pseudomonas. And that list is available on the website, on the WHO website. And just to show how global the problem is, and this is just one little example of a certain Klebsiella strain that appeared in 2000 in North Carolina and has then cropped up. I don't know whether traveling economy class or first class, they probably don't mind, but they ended up in a number of different countries, including Israel, onto New Delhi, back to Sweden and into South America. You can't contain these things once they emerge in one country. It's clearly a global issue. So what is being done? In November the 2013, Dame Sally Davies published her UK 5-year her UK report, and then the UK 5-year AMR strategy that's been alluded to followed that report. And then we had Jim O'Neill commissioned in 2014. Under the WHO, there was a report in 2014 on the global surveillance on AMR, and 2015 report on the risks, and then an action plan in 2016. The final O'Neill report was published in 2016, but interim reports were showing the scale of the problem even before that. But there's a lot of writing and a lot of words that describe the problem here. And in 2016, after the UN meeting, the industry got together, over 100 companies and associations around the world, to publish a declaration of involvement and commitment to actually try and contribute to the action. And so on. There's been further reports, attempts by an economic group to come up with a new valuation model to see how much would be a new antibiotic would really be worth if it worked, and action on development and stewardship. And as you heard, the WHO has this definite, almost conflicting challenge of getting wider access to the essential drugs. As you heard, most people in the less developed countries are more likely to die because they can't get the right antibiotic. But in our hospitals, there are going to be a few cases where the multi-resistance is causing problems. So there's an access, but a stewardship and looking after what we've got approach as well. So the 5-year AMR strategy in the UK is being refreshed. There were consultations through the Department of Health and Social Care Select Committee, and the draft of the new strategy is certainly being looked at by the members of the high-level steering group, as you heard earlier. In the first strategy, these areas were identified as the key areas for actually taking action in this country. So improving infection prevention and control, and as you heard in the UK, we're actually quite good at this. The MRSA problem hasn't disappeared, but it's been markedly reduced. A similar picture for resistant E. coli in hospitals. The resistance to ciprofloxacin and third-generation cephalosporins has come down over the last few years, but it's still not zero. Those resistant organisms are still around, and for individuals who get them, this is obviously a huge, big deal, as you heard earlier. So we do need to continue to do things to address these. Optimizing prescribing practice, as I've said, we should really concentrate on prescribing appropriately, using the right antibiotic in the right circumstance to ensure that we minimize the future effects on creating more resistance. We need to improve professional education and training, which is partly why we're here today, I suppose, but also public engagement, as you heard. We want the general public to understand sufficiently that they don't go in and put pressure on our GPs who don't have a lot of time to prescribe antibiotics just because it's the easy thing to do. And originally, if you go back to the 60s and the 70s, GPs, the mentality was that, well, we can give you a penicillin because it won't do any harm. But now we're beginning to understand that the harm is not with that patient, it's with the development of resistance. So we really don't want that pressure from patients to give me an antibiotic because I feel ill and want to get back to work, or I want my kid to stop crying and that sort of thing. If it's not bacterial, then it's not going to actually help that. We do need to be developing new drugs, treatments and diagnostics. We need better access to and the use of the surveillance data in terms of those multi-resistant pathogens that the WHO has identified. Not all of those are routinely recorded in the UK NHS yet. We're working on that, and it's improving, but some of them are not fully covered in the surveillance data. We need better identification and prioritization of the what research might become effective, not just looking at whether we can develop new antibiotics within the major classes or possibly a new class, but looking at the alternatives of the type you've heard this morning. And we need strengthened international collaboration because it's a global issue, and we can help each other. All the stakeholders in this country can help through collaboration, which you've heard this morning, but we can also be collaborating through the international networks to try and address these issues. From a pharmaceutical industry perspective, we are involved in some of these, but not all of them. We are traditionally quite well equipped to help with education, but we need to work in collaboration with the government and the MRC and the BMA to agree what communication should be done in terms of education, what the messages are, and how we deliver those consistently to everybody throughout the country. On that basis, we have a standing collaboration with the Department of Health and Social Care, an industry working group, DHS industry working group, which meets quarterly, and subgroups, one of which is wrestling really with this valuation and reimbursement and whether we can rebuild a sustainable market for developing these antibiotics. And the second is a subgroup that's going to do more work in the new year on appropriate use, stewardship and education around that. We've heard about One Health, and this is one of the slightly complicated diagrams, but fundamentally it's covering humans, animals, agriculture and the environment. And we're looking to prevent infections, protect the drugs we have, and promote the development of new drugs. And there's a lot more detail obviously underlying that as you go into it. And that's, you can probably tell by the colours, that's a government slide that I've borrowed for today. Right, so from the industry viewpoint, the commercial reality, in 1990, we were recognizing that we've got a lot of antibiotics, so they're all going generic, so the prices were fairly low. The opportunity for coming up with something really new that was significantly better than what we'd already got was quite low. And so companies who are answerable to shareholders were beginning to reduce their commitment to this area in favor of investing in other areas of research and development of new medicines. So in 1990, there were 18 major companies globally, large companies committed to antibiotic research and development. By 2013, this had dropped to only 4, and this is really why there's a real concern. There's not the commitment to investment that there used to be. However, all that activity that we looked at with the slide where the WHO have documented the issue, the UK have documented the issue, Sally Davies has gone around the world speaking about the issue, and the UN discussion, that some activity has been stimulated since 2013. AMR is a global issue. Many of our members are UK affiliates of global companies as an industry association, and so we are working to support that initiative that is going on. So most recently, as an industry, we've inputted to that Health and Social Care Select Committee inquiry, the 5-year AMR strategy refresh in the UK, and the NHS 10-year plan, which also has elements that will help address AMR in it. Internationally, we work with all the other industry associations through Europe, with FPA, the European Federation, the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, the US Pharmaceutical Research Manufacturers Association, and the Japanese. At the beginning of this year, there was, and if you recall, a lot of the initiatives were kicked off around 2016. So we've had like a 2-year progress report. The Industry Alliance, which kicked off with those 100 companies and associations, produced its own report, which concluded that in 2016, the industry had actually invested about $2 billion across 22 companies, many of these now newer, smaller companies involved, which is great news. 80% of these companies engaged in activities to support appropriate use, 90% support surveillance work around the world, and we support the WHO Action Plan to improve the access, and that includes making sure that medicines that were on the essential drugs list, particularly out of those 5 major classes, are actually registered in as many countries as possible. Only this year, a couple of months ago, the Alliance launched the first list of discharge targets, because the environment, not just the use in animals, but the leakage of effluent into the environment from factories making antibiotics is an issue. And we've now got targets to minimize the amount of antimicrobial molecules that are leaked into the environment accidentally, and it's only in the recent years that we've recognized that that might be a contributor to resistance development. That was the industry telling you what the industry has done. This is a benchmark report released in the same month, in January this year, by the Access to Medicines Foundation, which is an independent body, and concluded much the same thing. There is stuff going on. Research and development, there are 18 companies were assessed, some large, some small, and there are about 40 antimicrobials, 28 of those antibiotics, in development that target the priority resistant pathogens. So there is activity going on at the moment. There's a potential to use vaccines, of course. If we have there are decent vaccines against strep pneumoniae, which has helped to reduce the incidence of infections due to that. When you're looking at these multi-resistant pathogens, some of which, when they're not resistant, are natural components of the microbiome, I think you would have to look very carefully if you developed a vaccine against E. coli or Klebsiella, who would you actually vaccinate with that? Because you don't want to knock out all the naturally occurring components of the microbiome and upset the natural balance there. But you would be able to use it possibly in ill people going into hospital to prevent them catching these multi-resistant pathogens there. There's a clue, I think, to the future in the fact that 66 out of the 130 projects that are being run with industry are actually being carried out in partnership. So they are jointly funded with Research Council money or charity money, which helps share the risk and make projects happen that otherwise might not be funded. So this concept of partnership in research particularly is right out there now, and this is helping to keep some activity going at the moment. Well, I've mentioned appropriate access and stewardship. Access needs to be geographically broader, we mentioned, and 9 companies in this review support surveillance programs in a total of 147 countries, so that's quite a large number, but many of those surveillance programs are really looking at susceptibility and resistance in the community, in primary care pathogens, not so much in the hospital setting. And manufacturing and production, we've mentioned there are new targets for discharge limits. So just to start to wrap up, looking ahead, what would you expect from industry? Any comments? Obviously, we would be looking to discover new medicines. Obviously, developing those, taking them right through from what's going on in the laboratories through the clinical trials, formulation, manufacture to regulatory approval. And if we're doing that, we'd be probably willing to champion appropriate use and stewardship. We've always supported education in any of the therapy areas that we've got medicines in. We would be happy to continue to support surveillance. And then perhaps we may be able to get involved in investigating some of these new and different approaches, such as the one you've heard this morning, but also the vaccines, the phage therapy, oligonucleotides, the microbiome transplant approach, which was mentioned this morning as well. But there is an issue with the commercial reality, the fact the market has not been attractive for some time. And we are working with government to try and create an economic environment in which the investment in antibiotic R&D is once again fully sustainable, to create a continuous, not huge, but a continuous pipeline of new products, new approaches that will help to ensure we can deal with these multi-resistant pathogens as and when they arise. So what's a good antibacterial target? It should be present in the required spectrum of the organisms, should be absent in humans, giving you that selective toxicity that we've always had quite effectively with antibiotics. The target in the bacteria should be essential for bacterial growth, and I've showed you several of the mechanisms that we already know about. It'd be interesting and useful if we could find a mechanism that we haven't already looked at. It should be expressed and relevant to the infection process, so that what makes pathogens pathogenic. And something about the function of that target should be known, so that we know if we knock it out that it might have the desired effect. So, aside from just developing more antibiotics, some of which might be in classes that we've already got, there's two angles that you might want to think about going ahead and keep an eye out for. One is, can we bypass those resistance mechanisms that we talked about? And the other is the completely new approaches that I mentioned. So there are problems and possible solutions right the way through the whole process of screening and medicinal chemistry and animal studies, further development through clinical trials and the licensing. And there are possible solutions at each of these stages. I won't go into this in huge detail, but I hope we'll be able to make most of these slides available to you after the event. And there are some approaches already. In terms of the inactivating enzymes as a resistance mechanism, beta-lactamase inhibitors have been developed and have been around since Augmentin was launched in 1981, clavulanate being the beta-lactamase inhibitor, which enables then the amoxicillin component to carry on and do the job that of killing the bacteria that it was always capable of doing. More recently, a hospital version in piperacillin tazobactam, where tazobactam is the beta-lactamase inhibitor. There's also a very interesting possibility in development. These bacteria need iron, and this is, you may have heard recently, this is the Trojan horse idea of if you tag onto the iron which the bacteria needs, it will take the cephalosporin into the cell and it can do its antibacterial job, whereas the cephalosporins may have been prevented through decreased uptake mechanisms. So that's getting around that by increasing the uptake through chelating with something that the bacteria needs to import. And there are two other areas that could be worked, that have been worked on and could be effective if we could find something. The bacteria that develop efflux pumps to pump the antibiotic out as fast as it goes in, we could look at trying to inhibit those efflux pumps, and in the laboratory 1 or 2 of those have been developed, but nothing's made it through to being an effective medicine yet. And the last of these is the potential for having membrane permeabilizers, which will allow things to go through the membrane that were otherwise excluded. So those are possible approaches to evading the resistance mechanisms. And finally, there's a list of other approaches which are at various early stages in research. So there are obviously antibodies, which includes vaccines, immune stimulation to help the body's own defenses do a better job, microbiome probiotic approaches, particularly for gut infections, enzymes used by bacteriophages to destroy the walls of the target bacteria, which means that you wouldn't have to use the bacteriophage itself, but you might use the enzyme they produce to destroy the cell walls. The bacteriophages themselves, those viruses that infect and kill bacteria, they can be wild type or engineered. Obviously the concern here is the virus itself could become pathogenic, so there needs to be an awful lot of care with that. There are transcription factor decoys being worked on relating to oligonucleotides to prevent the expression of those genes that the bacteria need to survive. Peptides with either direct effect or through the host defense mechanisms. And more recently, the recognition that a lot of the bacteria in infection sites in the body actually exist in some sort of biofilm, which makes it difficult for ordinary antibiotics to reach the bacteria. But if we can develop peptides that break up that biofilm, then maybe the original antibacterials can get in after all. Okay, so that's really concludes a sort of a bit of a whistle-stop tour around everything to do from an industry viewpoint. I'd like to just conclude by saying that the industry's playing its part as far as we can at the moment. We've obviously, on those measures, we have some involvement in R&D still, with access, with appropriate use and manufacturing. We do need to maintain momentum. We have a fragile consensus at the moment with about 7 major companies actually active in the UK on this front that we talk to regularly, and we're trying to work with government, particularly to confirm the commitment to a new economic model. So we're ready and willing with the government and all the stakeholders, and I think the key thing here is collaboration across all the stakeholders as we go forward to make things actually happen. We need this commercial reality to be recognised and to recreate an economic environment in which investment is sustainable. The model that we're working on with the Department of Health and Social Care and the rest of the government is, as was mentioned earlier, completely delinking payments from volume of usage so that we can write an absolute appropriate usage plan for the new antibiotic. This will vary from antibiotic to antibiotic. It will depend on which pathogens it's attacking, which infections we're going to look at, from just being another antibiotic in the rotational use in secondary care to actually being that one that's reserved on the shelf behind the glass plate that says in emergency break glass and use it. But whichever sort of this antibiotic it turns out to be, the idea is that there is a valuation against the future risk of the health problems that were described by the O'Neill report, and that the negotiation of reimbursement, which might be an annual fee, completely separate from volume usage, would be sufficient to encourage companies to reinvest and to maintain the pipeline looking forward. So really that's where I'd like to close, but I'd really be interested for